Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who like books. My name is Heather Wardover, and I'm podcasting from my corner of the Sonoran Desert, the Old Pueblo, Tucson, Arizona. Episode 78, Cue the Monster. Well, hello! I hope you have all had a wonderful week. I actually have. I have finished my semester at the university. I have collected all 4,000 finals and 8,000 drafts that I have to read. Draft revisions. I told the kids that they could revise papers until the end of the semester because, of course, as a writing teacher, my job is to encourage them to write. And I've also been, while I've been doing all these things, listening to Frankenstein. This week I'm bringing you 3 chapters, and I have to, because the first 2 chapters we're going to listen to, it's about half an hour of chapter 3 and chapter 4. Chapter 3 and 4 are Victor telling Walton all about his childhood and eventually his schooling. And you really, really need to understand Victor. It's crucial to the rest of the book. So it kind of feels ponderous in some parts, and it also kind of feels, a little on the dull side, because you're kind of sitting there waiting for the movie part to start. Where's that guy with the nodes on his neck? This opening part, you have to remember, is Victor talking. So Victor is going to tell you all sorts of things. The important thing to remember while you are listening to Victor talking is this. Mary was 18 when she wrote this book. That was the summer that they were in the castle, and Byron came up with this idea that since it was raining and gloomy outside and they were all reading ghost stories to each other, that they should compete and see who could write the best ghost story, and Mary won the competition. 2 years later, after a lot more writing and heavy editing, the book was published and it was a great success. But she was 18 when she wrote this. She was 16 when she ran away with Percy. Shelley was married to a woman named Harriet at the time, and shortly after this challenge for writing the book, before it was published, Harriet, Percy's actual wife, pregnant with his child, drowned herself in the Thames. Shelley had to go back for the inquest to prove that he didn't throw her in the Thames, exonerated himself, went back to Mary, and then they get married and have a tense but reasonably happy marriage until he dies. I know, lots of fun, right? Again, she's 18 when she writes this. She's 18 when she conceives of this Victor Frankenstein. And you have to keep in mind, aside from the fact that she's 18, that she lost her mother when she was a baby. She was born, her mom died a week or 2 later. She never knew her mom. She was raised by her father, and she was raised among great intellects and great writers. So I find her first 2 chapters where she details Victor's life to be breathtakingly brilliant, beautifully written, and they set you up so perfectly for what will happen next that you won't even see it coming. That's how good it is. So as you listen, just kind of let it wash over you. Don't worry about the details too much. I will remind you of details that matter when they're going to matter. But for now, just kind of get a big, broad picture of Victor's schooling and his prejudices and his biases and his interests. And also listen to, I find it interesting anyway, listen to how interesting it is how science has changed and the perception of science has changed. And never, never forget that the people who this book are populated with are people created by a romantic, capital R. This is people reacting to the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment, and they are enamored of things like supernatural events and kind of windswept, stormy terrain and nature's beauty in both its glory, as in, a glorious sunset or a spectacular sunrise, but also in nature's beauty in that kind of tempest-tossed, rocky coast of Maine with a slate gray sky and the waves beating on the rocks with, this fabulous stormy ocean. All of that was beautiful to them. All of that was grand. And I think that's where they found their spirituality. That's where they found their connection to a larger world and meaning and importance and depth. And you hear all of that coming through in Victor. The other thing that you will hear them value over and over again in this book is friendship and family. And so with that, I'm going to let you start off on chapters 3 and 4 of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley.
When I had attained the age of 17, my parents resolved that I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had hitherto attended the schools of Geneva, but my father thought it necessary for the completion of my education I should be made acquainted with other customs than those of my native country. My departure was therefore fixed at an early date, but before the day resolved upon could arrive, the first misfortune of my life occurred, an omen, as it were, of my future misery. Elizabeth had caught the scarlet fever. Her illness was severe, and she was in the greatest danger. During her illness, many arguments had been urged to persuade my mother to refrain from attending upon her. She had at first yielded to our entreaties, but when she heard that the life of her favourite was menaced, she could no longer control her anxiety. She attended her sick bed. Her watchful attentions triumphed over the malignity of the distemper. Elizabeth was saved, but the consequences of this imprudence were fatal to her preserver. On the 3rd day, my mother sickened. Her fever was accompanied by the most alarming symptoms, and the looks of her medical attendants prognosticated the worst event. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this best of women did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed in the prospect of your union. This expectation will now be the consolation of your father. Elizabeth, my love, you must supply my place to my younger children. Alas, I regret that I am taken from you, and, happy and beloved as I have been, is it not hard to quit you all? But these are not thoughts befitting me. I will endeavour to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." She died calmly, and her countenance expressed affection even in death. I need not describe the feelings of those whose dearest ties are rent by that most irreparable evil, the void that presents itself to the soul and the despair that is exhibited on the countenance. It is so long before the mind can persuade itself that she whom we saw every day, and whose very existence appeared part of our own, can have departed forever, that the brightness of a beloved eye can have been extinguished, and the sound of a voice, so familiar and dear to the ear, can be hushed, never more to be heard. These are the reflections of the first days. But when the lapse of time proves the reality of the evil, then the actual bitterness of grief commences. Yet from whom has not the rude hand rent away some dear connection? And why should I describe a sorrow which all have felt and must feel? The time at length arrives when grief is rather an indulgence than a necessity, and the smile that plays upon the lips, although it may be deemed a sacrilege, is not banished. My mother was dead, but we had still duties we ought to perform. We must continue our course with the rest, and learn to think ourselves fortunate whilst one remains whom the spoiler has not seized. My departure for Ingolstadt, which had been deferred by these events, was now again determined upon. I obtained from my father a respite of some weeks. It appeared to me sacrilege so soon to leave the repose akin to death of the house of mourning and to rush into the thick of life. I was new to sorrow, but it did not the less alarm me. I was unwilling to quit the sight of those that remained to me, and above all, I desired to see my sweet Elizabeth in some degree consoled. She indeed veiled her grief, and strove to act the comforter to us all. She looked steadily on life, and assumed its duties with courage and zeal. She devoted herself to those whom she had been taught to call her uncle and cousins. Never was she so enchanting as at this time, when she recalled the sunshine of her smiles and spent them upon us. She forgot even her own regret in her endeavours to make us forget. The day of my departure at length arrived. Clerval spent the last evening with us. He had endeavoured to persuade his father to permit him to accompany me and to become my fellow student, but in vain. His father was a narrow-minded trader and saw idleness and ruin in the aspirations and ambition of his son. Henry deeply felt the misfortune of being debarred from a liberal education. He said little, but when he spoke, I read in his kindling eye and in his animated glance a restrained but firm resolve not to be chained to the miserable details of commerce. We sat late. We could not tear ourselves away from each other, nor persuade ourselves to say the word farewell. It was said, and we retired under the pretence of seeking repose, each fancying the other was deceived. But when at morning's dawn I descended to the carriage which was to convey me away, they were all there. My father, again to bless me, Clerval, to press my hand once more, my Elizabeth to renew her entreaties that I would write often and to bestow the last feminine attentions on her playmate and friend. I threw myself into the chaise that was to convey me away and indulged in the most melancholy reflections. I, who had ever been surrounded by amiable companions, continually engaged in endeavouring to bestow mutual pleasure. I was now alone. In the university whither I was going, I must form my own friends and be my own protector. My life had hitherto been remarkably secluded and domestic, and this had given me invincible repugnance to new countenances. I loved my brothers, Elizabeth and Clerval. These were old familiar faces, but I believed myself totally unfitted for the company of strangers. Such were my reflections as I commenced my journey. But as I proceeded, my spirits and hopes rose. I ardently desired the acquisition of knowledge. I had often, when at home, thought it hard to remain during my youth cooped up in one place, and had longed to enter the world and take my station among other human beings. Now my desires were complied with, and it would indeed have been folly to repent. I had sufficient leisure for these and many other reflections during my journey to Ingolstadt, which was long and fatiguing. At length, the high white steeple of the town met my eyes. I alighted and was conducted to my solitary apartment to spend the evening as I pleased. The next morning I delivered my letters of introduction and paid a visit to some of the principal professors. Chance, or rather the evil influence, the angel of destruction, which asserted omnipotent sway over me from the moment I turned my reluctant steps from my father's door, led me first to Monsieur Krempe, professor of natural philosophy. He was an uncouth man, but deeply imbued in the secrets of his science. He asked me several questions concerning my progress in the different branches of science appertaining to natural philosophy. I replied carelessly, and partly in contempt, mentioned the names of my alchemists as the principal authors I had studied. The professor stared. "Have you," he said, "really spent your time in studying such nonsense?" I replied in the affirmative. "Every minute," continued Monsieur Krempe with warmth, "every instant that you have wasted on those books is utterly and entirely lost. You have burdened your memory with exploded systems and useless names. Good God! In what desert land have you lived, where no one was kind enough to inform you that these fancies which you have so greedily imbibed are 1,000 years old and as musty as they are ancient? I little expected, in this enlightened and scientific age, to find a disciple of Albertus Magnus and Paracelsus. My dear sir, you must begin your studies entirely anew." So saying, he stepped aside and wrote down a list of several books treating of natural philosophy which he desired me to procure. and dismissed me after mentioning that in the beginning of the following week he intended to commence a course of lectures upon natural philosophy in its general relations, and that Monsieur Waldman, a fellow professor, would lecture upon chemistry the alternate days he omitted. I returned home not disappointed, for I have said that I had long considered those authors useless whom the professor reprobated, but I returned not at all the more inclined to recur to these studies in any shape. Monsieur Krempe was a little squat man with a gruff voice and a repulsive countenance. The teacher, therefore, did not prepossess me in favour of his pursuits. In rather a too philosophical and connected strain, perhaps, I have given an account of the conclusions I had come to concerning them in my early years. As a child, I had not been content with the results promised by the modern professors of natural science. With a confusion of ideas only to be accounted for by my extreme youth and my want of a guide on such matters, I had retrod the steps of knowledge along the paths of time and exchanged the discoveries of recent inquirers for the dreams of forgotten alchemists. Besides, I had a contempt for the uses of modern natural philosophy. It was very different when the masters of the science sought immortality and power. Such views, although futile, were grand. But now the scene was changed. The ambition of the inquirer seemed to limit itself to the annihilation of those visions on which my interest in the science was chiefly founded. I was required to exchange chimeras of boundless grandeur for realities of little worth. Such were my reflections during the first 2 or 3 days of my residence at Ingolstadt, which were chiefly spent in becoming acquainted with the localities and the principal residents in my new abode. But as the ensuing week commenced, I thought of the information which Monsieur Krempe had given me concerning the lectures. And although I could not consent to go and hear that little conceited fellow deliver sentences out of the pulpit, I recollected what he had said of Monsieur Waldman, whom I had never seen, as he had hitherto been out of town. Partly from curiosity, and partly from idleness, I went into the lecturing room, which Monsieur Waldman entered shortly after. This professor was very unlike his colleague. He appeared about 50 years of age, but with an aspect expressive of the greatest benevolence. A few grey hairs covered his temples, but those at the back of his head were nearly black. His person was short but remarkably erect, and his voice the sweetest I had ever heard. He began his lecture by a recapitulation of the history of chemistry and the various improvements made by different men of learning, pronouncing with fervour the names of the most distinguished discoverers. He then took a cursory view of the present state of the science and explained many of its elementary terms. After having made a few preparatory experiments, he concluded with a panegyric upon modern chemistry, the terms of which I shall never forget. The ancient teachers of this science, he said, promised impossibilities and performed nothing. The modern masters promise very little. They know that metals cannot be transmuted and that the excelsior of life is a chimera. But these philosophers, whose hands seem only made to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscope or crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in our hiding places. They ascend into the heavens. They have discovered how the blood circulates and the nature of the air we breathe. They have acquired new and almost unlimited powers. They can command the thunders of heaven, mimic the earthquake, and even mock the invisible world with its own shadows. Such were the professor's words. Rather, let me say, such the words of the fate announced to destroy me. As he went on, I felt as if my soul were grappling with a palpable enemy. One by one, the various keys were touched which formed the mechanism of my being. Chord after chord was sounded, and soon my mind was filled with one thought, one conception, one purpose. So much has been done, exclaimed the soul of Frankenstein. More, far more will I achieve. Treading in the steps already marked, I will pioneer a new way, explore unknown powers, and unfold to the world the deepest mysteries of creation. I closed my eyes that night. My internal being was in a state of insurrection and turmoil. I felt that order would thence arise, but I had no power to produce it. By degrees, after the morning's dawn, sleep came. I awoke, and my yesternight's thoughts were as a dream. There only remained a resolution to return to my ancient studies and to devote myself to a science for which I believe myself to possess a natural talent. On the same day, I paid Monsieur Waldman a visit. His manners in private were even more mild and attractive than in public, for there was a certain dignity in his mien during his lectures, which in his own house was replaced by the greatest affability and kindness. I gave him pretty nearly the same account of my former pursuits as I had given his fellow professor. He heard with attention the little narration concerning my studies, and smiled at the names of Cornelius Agrippa and Paracelsus, but without the contempt that Monsieur Krempe had exhibited. He said that these were men to whose indefatigable zeal modern philosophers were indebted for most of the foundations of their knowledge. They had left to us, as an easier task, to give new names and arrange in connected classifications the facts which they, in a great degree, had been the instruments of bringing to light. The labours of men of genius, however erroneously directed, scarcely ever fail in ultimately turning to the solid advantage of mankind. I listened to his statement, which was delivered without any presumption or affectation, and then added that his lecture had removed my prejudices against modern chemists. I expressed myself in measured terms, with the modesty and deference due from a youth to his instructor, without letting escape, inexperience in life would have made me ashamed, any of the enthusiasm which stimulated my intended labours. I requested his advice concerning books I ought to procure. I am happy, said Monsieur Waldman, to have gained a disciple, and if your application equals your ability, I have no doubt of your success. Chemistry is that branch of natural philosophy in which the greatest improvements have been and may be made. It is on that account that I have made it my peculiar study. But at the same time, I have not neglected the other branches of science. A man would make a very sorry chemist if he attended to that department of human knowledge alone. If your wish is to become really a man of science and not merely a petty experimentalist, I would advise you to apply to every branch of natural philosophy, including mathematics. He then took me into his laboratory and explained to me the uses of his various machines, instructing me as to what I ought to procure and promising me the use of his own when I should have advanced far enough in the science not to derange their mechanism. He also gave me a list of books which I had requested, and I took my leave. Thus ended a day memorable to me. It decided my future destiny.
I just wanted to remind those of you who are listening on either iTunes or another kind of MP3 player that recognizes chapters that I am including podcast chapter breaks in each episode so that you can easily fast forward or kind of jump to the beginning of the next chapter. And actually what I'm doing is I'm clicking to the beginning of the next chapter talk. So, chapter 3. I don't think there's anything in there that should be hugely shocking to anyone about the way Victor talks about himself, except that for those of you who aren't familiar with the guys that he's talking about, the people who he was reading, they're all alchemists, the people who thought that you could turn like lead into gold. And again, this is obviously a romantic notion. This is not a surprise it was mentioned in the previous chapter. One of the things that may have surprised you is that when Victor and Elizabeth's mom, or Elizabeth's stepmom, died, that she made it clear that she had hoped that they would get married. Of course, they're not related by blood, but they are growing up in the same house as brother and sister, and that's always a little odd to us these days. Although it reminded me of my dad has a friend who was over in Saudi Arabia, and my dad's a geographer who focuses on arid lands, so he and the people he works with are often overseas. And one of the guys that they were working with was going to a wedding, and it was his first cousins who were getting married, and one of the guys from the United States said, wow, we kind of can't do that in the United States. And the guy said, what, you marry a stranger? And I just thought, man, that sums up a pretty major culture difference. And it's kind of true. You know, you do marry someone who you don't actually know very well. I was lucky enough to have known my husband for years by the time we got married, and it made the whole thing very easy and peaceful and comfortable and quite happy, and it still is. Huh. And so I guess Victor and Elizabeth would be in the same kind of situation. They know they get along well together, and they certainly care about each other. The mother dying early on should make you remember that Mary Shelley's mother died when she was young, and this is going to set Victor up for some interesting, can you say foreshadowing, psychological imperatives in Victor's life. The other thing, of course, is that his mother died nobly. She didn't die tragically or screaming or, kicking her way out. She was very calm, and she was angelic, and she was this and that. And it's hard not to imagine that this is Mary Shelley idealizing her mom. It would be odd if it weren't, I guess, is where I'm going with that. So now we are heading into chapter 4, which is more of Victor's schooling, but this is where it actually gets a little twisted. Here we go.
Chapter 4. From this day, natural philosophy, and particularly chemistry, in the most comprehensive sense of the term, became nearly my sole occupation. I read with ardor those works so full of genius and discrimination which modern inquirers have written on these subjects. I attended the lectures and cultivated the acquaintance of the men of science of the university, and found even in Monsieur Krempe a great deal of sound sense and real information, combined, it is true, with a repulsive physiognomy and manners, but not, on that account, the less valuable. In Monsieur Waldman, I found a true friend. His gentleness was never tinged by dogmatism, and his instructions were given with an air of frankness and good nature that banished every idea of pedantry. In 1,000 ways he smoothed for me the path of knowledge and made the most abstruse inquiries clear and facile to my apprehension. My application was at first fluctuating and uncertain. It gained strength as I proceeded, and soon became so ardent and eager that the stars often disappeared in the light of morning, whilst I was yet engaged in my laboratory. As I applied so closely, it may be easily conceived that my progress was rapid. My ardor was indeed the astonishment of the students, and my proficiency that of the masters. Professor Krempe often asked me, with a sly smile, how Cornelius Agrippa went on, whilst Monsieur Waldman expressed the most heartfelt exultation in my progress. 2 years passed in this manner, during which I paid no visit to Geneva, but was engaged, heart and soul, in the pursuit of some discoveries which I hoped to make. None but those who have experienced them can conceive of the enticements of science. In other studies, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in scientific pursuit, there is continual food for discovery and wonder. A mind of moderate capacity which closely pursues one study must infallibly arrive at great proficiency in that study, and I, who continually sought the attainment of one object of pursuit and was solely wrapped up in this, improved so rapidly that at the end of 2 years I made some discoveries in the improvement of some chemical instruments, which procured me great esteem and admiration at the university. When I had arrived at this point and had become as well acquainted with the theory and practice of natural philosophy as depended on the lessons of any of the professors at Ingolstadt, my residence there being no longer conducive to my improvements, I thought of returning to my friends and my native town when an incident happened that protracted my stay. One of the phenomena which had peculiarly attracted my attention was the structure of the human frame, and indeed any animal endued with life. Whence, I often asked myself, did the principle of life proceed? It was a bold question, and one which has ever been considered as a mystery. Yet with how many things are we upon the brink of becoming acquainted, if cowardice or carelessness did not restrain our inquiries? I resolved these circumstances in my mind and determined thenceforth to apply myself more particularly to those branches of natural philosophy which related to physiology. Unless I had been animated by an almost supernatural enthusiasm, my application to this study would have been irksome and almost intolerable. To examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with the science of anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I must also observe the natural decay and corruption of the human body. In my education, my father had taken the greatest precautions that my mind should be impressed with no supernatural horrors. I do not even remember to have trembled at a tale of superstition or to have feared the apparition of a spirit. Darkness had no effect upon my fancy, and a churchyard was to me merely the receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which, from being the seat of beauty and strength, had become food for the worm. Now I was led to examine the cause and the progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. My attention was fixed upon every object the most insupportable to the delicacy of human feelings. I saw how the fine form of man was degraded and wasted. I beheld the corruption of death succeed to the blooming cheek of life. I saw how the worm inherited the wonders of the eye and the brain. I paused, examining and analyzing all the minutiae of causation, as exemplified in the change from life to death and death to life, until, from the midst of this darkness, a sudden light broke in upon me, a light so brilliant and wondrous, yet so simple, that while I became dizzy with the immensity of the prospect which it illuminated, I was surprised that among so many men of genius who had directed their inquiries towards the same science, that I alone should be reserved to discover so astonishing a secret. Remember, I am not recording the vision of a madman. The sun does not more certainly shine in the heavens than that which I now affirm is true. Some miracle might have produced it, yet the stages of the discovery were distinct and probable. After days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. The astonishment which I had at first experienced on this discovery soon gave place to delight and rapture. After so much time spent in painful labor, to arrive at once at the summit of my desires was the most gratifying consummation of my toils. But this discovery was so great and overwhelming that all the steps by which I had been progressively led to it were obliterated, and I beheld only the result. What had been the study and desire of the wisest men since the creation of the world was now within my grasp. Not that, like a magic scene, it all opened upon me at once. The information I had obtained was of a nature rather to direct my endeavors so soon as I should point them towards the object of my search, than to exhibit that object already accomplished. I was like the Arabian, who had been buried with the dead and found a passage to life aided only by one glimmering and seemingly ineffectual light. I see by your eagerness and the wonder and hope which your eyes express, my friend, that you expect to be informed of the secret with which I am acquainted. That cannot be. Listen patiently until the end of my story, and you will easily perceive why I am so reserved on that subject. I will not lead you on, unguarded and ardent as I then was, to your destruction and infallible misery. Learn from me, if not by my precepts, at least by my example, how dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world, than he who aspires to become greater than his nature will allow. When I found so astonishing a power placed within my hands, I hesitated a long time concerning the manner in which I should employ it. Although I possessed the capacity of bestowing life, yet to prepare a frame for the reception of it, with all its intricacies of fibers, muscles, and veins, still remained a work of inconceivable difficulty and labor. I doubted at first whether I should attempt the creation of a being like myself, or one of simpler organization. But my imagination was too much exalted by my first success to permit me to doubt of my ability to give life to an animal as complex and wonderful as man. The materials at present within my command hardly appeared adequate to so arduous an undertaking, but I doubted not that I should ultimately succeed. I prepared myself for a multitude of reverses. My operations might be incessantly baffled, and at last my work be imperfect, yet when I considered the improvement which every day takes place in science and mechanics, I was encouraged to hope my present attempts would at least lay the foundations of future success. Nor could I consider the magnitude and complexity of my plan as any argument of its impracticability. It was with these feelings that I began the creation of a human being. As the minuteness of the parts formed a great hindrance to my speed, I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make a being of gigantic stature, that is to say, about 8 feet in height and proportionally large. After having formed this determination and having spent some months in successfully collecting and arranging my materials, I began. No one can conceive the variety of feelings which bore me onwards. Like a hurricane in the first enthusiasm of success, life and death appeared to me ideal bounds which I should break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. Pursuing these reflections, I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might, in process of time, although I now found it impossible, to renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. These thoughts supported my spirits while I pursued my undertaking with unremitting ardor. My cheek had grown pale with study, and my person had become emaciated with confinement. Sometimes, on the very brink of certainty, I failed. Yet still I clung to the hope which the next day or the next hour might realize. One secret which I alone possessed was the hope to which I had dedicated myself, and the moon gazed on my midnight labors, while, with unrelaxed and breathless eagerness, I pursued nature to her hiding places. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave or tortured the living animal, animate the lifeless clay? My limbs now tremble, and my eyes swim with the remembrance. But then a resistless and almost frantic impulse urged me forward. I seemed to have lost all soul or sensation but for this one pursuit. It was indeed but a passing trance that only made me feel with renewed acuteness so soon as, the unnatural stimulus ceasing to operate, I had returned to my old habits. I collected bones from the charnel houses and disturbed with profaned fingers tremendous secrets of the human frame. In a solitary chamber, or rather cell, at the top of the house, and separated from all the other apartments by a gallery and staircase, I kept my workshop of filthy creation. My eyeballs were starting from their sockets and attending to the details of my employment. The dissecting room and the slaughterhouse furnished many of my materials, and often did my human nature turn with loathing from my occupation. While still urged on by an eagerness which perpetually increased, I brought my work near to a conclusion. The summer months passed while I was thus engaged, heart and soul, in one pursuit. It was a most beautiful season. Never did the fields bestow a more plentiful harvest, or the vines yield a more luxuriant vintage. But my eyes were insensible to the charms of nature, and the same feelings which made me neglect the scenes around me caused me also to forget those friends who were so many miles absent, and whom I had not seen for so long a time. I knew my silence disquieted them, and I well remembered the words of my father. I know that while you are pleased with yourself, you will think of us with affection, and we shall hear regularly from you. You must pardon me if I regard any interruption in your correspondence as a proof that your other duties are equally neglected. I knew well, therefore, what would be my father's feelings, but I could not tear my thoughts from my employment, loathsome in itself, but which had taken an irresistible hold of my imagination. I wished, as it were, to procrastinate all that related to my feelings of affection until the great object, which swallowed up every habit of my nature, should be completed. I then thought my father would be unjust if he ascribed my neglect to vice or faultiness on my part, but I am now convinced that he was justified in conceiving that I should not be altogether free from blame. A human being in perfection ought always to preserve a calm and peaceful mind, and never allow passion or a transitory desire to disturb his tranquillity. I do not think that the pursuit of knowledge is an exception to this rule. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful, that is to say, not befitting the human mind. If this rule were always observed, if no man allowed any pursuit whatsoever to interfere with the tranquillity of his domestic affections, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country, America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. But I forget that I am moralizing in the most interesting part of my tale, and your looks remind me to proceed. My father made no reproach in his letters, and only took notice of my silence by inquiring into my occupations more particularly than before. Winter, spring, and summer passed away during my labors, but I did not watch the blossom on the expanding leaves, sights which before always yielded me supreme delight, so deeply was I engrossed in my occupation. The leaves of that year had withered before my work drew near a close, and now every day showed me more plainly how well I had succeeded. But my enthusiasm was checked by my anxiety, and I appeared rather like one doomed by slavery to toil in the mines, or any other unwholesome trade, than an artist occupied by his favorite employment. Every night I was oppressed by a slow fever, and I became nervous to a most painful degree. The fall of a leaf startled me, and I shunned my fellow creatures as if I had been guilty of a crime. Sometimes I grew alarmed at the wreck I perceived that I had become, and the energy of my purpose alone sustained me. My labors would soon end, and I believed that exercise and amusement would then drive away incipient disease, and I promised myself both of these when my creation should be complete. End of chapter 4.
All righty then. So we now have Victor creating the monster. And I don't know about you, but the second that he said he was making the creature out of gigantic proportions and he was 8 feet tall, I immediately thought of Terry Garr. He must have an enormous Schwanzstücke. Young Frankenstein is really hard to get out of your head when you've seen it over and over and over again and you own the DVD. And yes, at some point I am probably going to record audio from it and play parts of it for you, because it's just not possible to not hear Gene Wilder's voice at some moments. So we'll enjoy that at some point. I hope you heard that he's trying to be quite clear that he's not crazy, and that he's also not going to tell Walton the secret to how to give life. That he has learned, unlike some scientists today, that there are some things you simply shouldn't mess with, and there is some knowledge that you simply shouldn't pass on. I know that Oppenheimer created the Exploratorium in San Francisco partly as a way to pay back humanity for having been involved in creating a nuclear weapon. And I think over time, there have been a number of scientists who kind of wish they could take it back. Mary Shelley's book, again, is a cautionary tale, and it is a reaction to the age of reason, to a scientific age, to a scientific awakening, and discussing the fact that there may simply be some rocks under which we should not look. And this is definitely the beginning of those moments in this book. I am going to go ahead and play chapter 5 for you because I can't not. I can't make you go through all of that learning about Victor and his toiling towards this moment without playing the moment for you. I'm not going to break into the narrative on this one because it's just too good for you to listen to straight through. But I do want you to know that this chapter is completely, as the last few chapters have been, completely from Victor's point of view. Later in the book, you will hear from other points of view. And Victor's is definitely one-sided. I've said before that I think he's rather selfish. It's not so much selfish here as it is really messed up. And anyone who is a parent will hear what I mean as you listen to this chapter. I don't want to give too much away, and it's hard to talk about this one without saying there's a lot of foreshadowing in the early part of this book. One of the other things to know is that Mary will quote Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And I'm thinking maybe when this book is done, we'll go back and we'll listen to somebody do a recording of The Ancient Mariner because it's just so bloody good. And you'll see why she kept quoting from it over and over and over again. So I think I'm looking through the book itself just to make sure. Um, I'm just going to start it for you. I will probably not talk a whole lot about it at the end because you just simply won't need it. It's really a good chapter. And it was always, after doing things like The Scarlet Letter and some really heavy and ponderous books, it was always, I know, fun for my kids to finally get a book where, yeah, you have to slog through the first couple chapters, but you get to the good stuff pretty fast in Frankenstein. So if you've hung on this far, this is now where the roller coaster ride really starts. So here we go with chapter 5 and a completely different reader.
It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. The rain pattered dismally against the panes, and my candle was nearly burnt out, when by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful, great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. The different accidents of life are not so changeable as the feelings of human nature. I had worked hard for nearly 2 years, for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. For this I had deprived myself of rest and health. I had desired it with an ardor that far exceeded moderation. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room and continued a long time traversing my bedchamber, unable to compose my mind to sleep. At length, lassitude succeeded to the tumult I had before endured, and I threw myself on the bed in my clothes, endeavoring to seek a few moments of forgetfulness. But it was in vain. I slept, indeed, but I was disturbed by the wildest dreams. I thought I saw Elizabeth in the bloom of health, walking in the streets of Ingolstadt. Delighted and surprised, I embraced her, but as I imprinted the first kiss on her lips, they became livid with the hue of death. Her features appeared to change, and I thought that I held the corpse of my dead mother in my arms. A shroud enveloped her form, and I saw the grave worms crawling in the folds of the flannel. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead, my teeth chattered, and every limb became convulsed. When, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, as it forced its way through the window shutters, I beheld the wretch, the miserable monster whom I had created. He held up the curtain of the bed, and his eyes, if eyes they may be called, were fixed on me. His jaws opened, and he muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. He might have spoken, but I did not hear. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped and rushed downstairs. I took refuge in the courtyard belonging to the house which I inhabited, where I remained during the rest of the night, walking up and down in the greatest agitation, listening attentively, catching and fearing each sound, as if it were to announce the approach of the demoniacal corpse to which I had so miserably given life. Oh, no mortal could support the horror of that countenance. A mummy again endued with animation could not be so hideous as that wretch. I had gazed on him while unfinished. He was ugly then, but when those muscles and joints were rendered capable of motion, it became a thing such as even Dante could not have conceived. I passed the night wretchedly. Sometimes my pulse beat so quickly and hardly that I felt the palpitation of every artery. At others, I nearly sank to the ground through languor and extreme weakness. Mingled with this horror, I felt the bitterness of disappointment. Dreams that had been my food and pleasant rest for so long a space were now become a hell to me. And the change was so rapid, the overthrow so complete. Morning, dismal and wet, at length dawned, and discovered to my sleepless and aching eyes the church of Ingolstadt, its white steeple and clock which indicated the 6th hour. The porter opened the gates of the court, which had that night been my asylum, and I issued into the streets, pacing them with quick steps, as if I sought to avoid the wretch whom I feared every turning of the street would present to my view. I did not dare return to the apartment which I inhabited, but felt impelled to hurry on, although drenched by the rain which poured from a black and comfortless sky. I continued walking in this manner for some time, endeavoring by bodily exercise to ease the load that weighed upon my mind. I traversed the streets without any clear conception of where I was or what I was doing. My heart palpitated in the sickness of fear, and I hurried on with irregular steps, not daring to look about me. Like one who on a lonely road doth walk in fear and dread, and having once turned round walks on and turns no more his head, because he knows a frightful fiend doth close behind him tread. Coleridge's Ancient Mariner. Continuing thus, I came at length opposite to the inn at which the various diligences and carriages usually stopped. Here I paused, I knew not why, but I remained some minutes with my eyes fixed on a coach that was coming towards me from the other end of the street. As it drew nearer, I observed that it was the Swiss diligence. It stopped just where I was standing, and on the door being opened, I perceived Henry Clerval, who on seeing me instantly sprung out. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed he, "how glad I am to see you! How fortunate that you should be here at the very moment of my alighting." Nothing could equal my delight on seeing Clerval. His presence brought back to my thoughts my father, Elizabeth, and all those scenes of home so dear to my recollection. I grasped his hand, and in a moment forgot my horror and misfortune. I felt suddenly, and for the first time during many months, calm and serene joy. I welcomed my friend, therefore, in the most cordial manner, and we walked towards my college. Clerval continued talking for some time about our mutual friends, and his own good fortune in being permitted to come to Ingolstadt. "You may easily believe," said he, "how great was the difficulty to persuade my father that all necessary knowledge was not comprised in the noble art of bookkeeping. And indeed, I believe I left him incredulous to the last, for his constant answer to my unwearied entreaties was the same as that of the Dutch schoolmaster and the vicar of Wakefield. 'I have 10,000 florins a year without Greek. I eat heartily without Greek.' But his affection for me at length overcame his dislike of learning, and he has permitted me to undertake a voyage of discovery to the land of knowledge. It gives me the greatest delight to see you, but tell me how you left my father, brothers, and Elizabeth." "Very well and very happy, only a little uneasy that they hear from you so seldom." By the by, I mean to lecture you a little upon their account myself. But, my dear Frankenstein, continued he, stopping short and gazing full in my face, I did not before remark how very ill you appear. So thin and pale. You look as if you had been watching for several nights. You have guessed right. I have lately been so deeply engaged in one occupation that I have not allowed myself sufficient rest, as you see. But I sincerely hope, that all these employments are now at an end, and that I am at length free. I trembled excessively. I could not endure to think of, and far less to allude to, the occurrences of the preceding night. I walked with a quick pace, and we soon arrived at my college. I then reflected, and the thought made me shiver, that the creature whom I had left in my apartment might still be there, alive and walking about. I dreaded to behold this monster, but I feared still more that Henry should see him. Entreating him, therefore, to remain a few minutes at the bottom of the stairs, I darted up towards my own room. My hand was already on the lock of the door before I recollected myself. I then paused, and a cold shivering came over me. I threw the door forcibly open, as children are accustomed to do when they expect a spectre to stand in waiting for them on the other side, but nothing appeared. I stepped fearfully in. The apartment was empty, and my bedroom was also freed from its hideous guest. I could hardly believe that so great a good fortune could have befallen me. But when I became assured that my enemy had indeed fled, I clapped my hands for joy and ran down to Clerval. We ascended into my room, and the servant presently brought breakfast. But I was unable to contain myself. It was not joy only that possessed me. I felt my flesh tingle with excess of sensitiveness, and my pulse beat rapidly. I was unable to remain for a single instant in the same place. I jumped over the chairs, clapped my hands, and laughed aloud. Clerval at first attributed my unusual spirits to joy on his arrival. But when he observed me more attentively, he saw a wildness in my eyes for which he could not account, and my loud, unrestrained, heartless laughter frightened and astonished him. "My dear Victor," cried he, "what for God's sake is the matter? Do not laugh in that manner. How ill you are! What is the cause of all this?" "Do not ask me," cried I, putting my hands before my eyes, for I thought I saw the dreaded spectre glide into the room. "He can tell. Oh, save me! Save me!" I imagined that the monster seized me. I struggled furiously and fell down in a fit. Poor Clerval! What must have been his feelings? A meeting which he anticipated with such joy, so strangely turned to bitterness. But I was not the witness of his grief, for I was lifeless and did not recover my senses for a long, long time. This was the commencement of a nervous fever which confined me for several months. During all that time, Henry was my only nurse. I afterwards learned that, knowing my father's advanced age and unfitness for so long a journey, and how wretched my sickness would make Elizabeth, he spared them this grief by concealing the extent of my disorder. He knew that I could not have a more kind and attentive nurse than himself, and, firm in the hope he felt of my recovery, he did not doubt that, instead of doing harm, he performed the kindest action that he could towards them. But I was in reality very ill, and surely nothing but the unbounded and unremitting attentions of my friend could have restored me to life. The form of the monster on whom I had bestowed existence was forever before my eyes, and I raved incessantly concerning him. Doubtless my words surprised Henry. He at first believed them to be the wanderings of my disturbed imagination, But the pertinacity with which I continually recurred to the same subject persuaded him that my disorder indeed owed its origin to some uncommon and terrible event. By very slow degrees, and with frequent relapses that alarmed and grieved my friend, I recovered. I remember the first time I became capable of observing outward objects with any kind of pleasure. I perceived that the fallen leaves had disappeared and that the young buds were shooting forth from the trees that shaded my window. It was a divine spring, and the season contributed greatly to my convalescence. I felt also sentiments of joy and affection revive in my bosom. My gloom disappeared, and in a short time I became as cheerful as before I was attacked by the fatal passion. "Dearest Clerval," exclaimed I, "how kind, how very good you are to me. This whole winter, instead of being spent in study as you promised yourself, has been consumed in my sick room. How shall I ever repay you? I feel the greatest remorse for the disappointment of which I have been the occasion. But you will forgive me. You will repay me entirely if you do not discompose yourself, but get well as fast as you can. And since you appear in such good spirits, I may speak to you on one subject, may I not?" I trembled. One subject. What could it be? Could he allude to an object on whom I dared not even think? "Compose yourself," said Clerval, who observed my change of color. "I will not mention it if it agitates you. But your father and cousin would be very happy if they received a letter from you in your own handwriting. They hardly know how ill you have been and are uneasy at your long silence." "Is that all, my dear Henry? How could you suppose that my first thought would not fly towards those dear, dear friends whom I love, and who are so deserving of my love? If this is your present temper, my friend, you will perhaps be glad to see a letter that has been lying here some days for you. It is from your cousin, I believe." This is the end of Chapter 5.
So next week, we hear the letter. So the monster's awake. And somewhere. And Victor has no idea where. And he's been recuperating for how long now? And still has no idea where. My goodness. He's just not very aware. Have a great week. I will talk to you soon. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who like books. My name is Heather Wardover, and I'm podcasting from my corner of the Sonoran Desert, the Old Pueblo, Tucson, Arizona. Episode 79. Oh, the weather outside is... Hello, it is I, and I am coming to you once again, you won't believe it, with a cold. Yes, this time my charming little thing too came home ill and promptly passed it on to Mom. I think my weakened lungs are, how you say, weak. And evidently anything I come into contact with this holiday season is going to be with me for a little while. So far I'm able to, swallow and breathe and stay vertical for most of the day. So I think that's pretty good. And I thought I would go ahead and muscle through a podcast tonight because, gosh darn it, we only woke the monster last week. I feel it would be a little unfair for me to cut out on you so quickly. This week, boy, do we need to get on with the chapters because we've got some really good ones. We're on to Chapter 6, and we're going to do Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 today. Chapter 6 will, as you may recall, will pick up exactly where Chapter 5 left off, with Victor opening a letter from Elizabeth. So Chapter 6 begins with no introduction whatsoever. It is the text of Elizabeth's letter. I will tell you a couple of things to listen to. One, The story of Justine matters. Listen to how Justine's family treats her and listen to what happens to Justine. And then know this. There are many scholars who feel that Justine, at least Justine's backstory, is Mary Shelley, which puts an interesting spin on it, and you'll see why today. There's also some language things that are going to happen during the course of this book. One is that you're going to hear the word Oriental and Orientalist bandied about, and of course, this is just the early 1800s stand-in for what people now say is East Asian or Pacific Rim, depending on what part of the Asian continent you're talking about or subcontinent. So I know the language is archaic, and I hope it doesn't offend anyone. It certainly wasn't meant to be offensive. And there will be more similar kind of archaic constructions that will hit later on in the book. But for today, that's the one you're going to hear. I also want to draw your attention to how very, very important Clerval is as both a character foil, and a friend. You are supposed to notice clearly the difference between Victor and Clerval, and the difference is palpable. Some of you have already written to me about what a pig Victor is. In fact, I will be reading a letter to you from one of our CraftLit listeners about Victor and what a schmuck he is. But this first chapter is not terribly long, but it does have this letter from Elizabeth, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that it brings into question the whole reliable narrator question. It brings into question the whole question of the reliable narrator. That's just lousy grammar. I'm so sorry to have subjected you to that. We've talked about reliable narrators in the past, and this is another one of those moments. Victor is allegedly telling this story to Walton. There is not a chance that he would have either the letter on his body in a way that he would be able to read it to Walton, nor would he have been able to commit it to memory. Well, I guess he could have, but this wouldn't have been the letter that he would have committed to memory. Nor would Walton have been able to write it down verbatim. It's interesting because on the surface, when you hear the letter, you'll think, oh, well, this is great because it opens up the narrative and you get to know what Elizabeth is thinking about, and you kind of get to see outside of Victor's really extraordinarily limited scope. And you get to find out what other people are saying, what other people are seeing and doing, and that's wonderful. And this book is definitely built on those, they're called diegetic levels, the story within a story within a story within a story. Well, that's all well and good. And it certainly makes the book more interesting. But if you're looking at this as literature with a capital, oh my goodness, it's a classic, there are definitely going to be people who point out, well, that's impossible. I mean, you couldn't have a verbatim letter in a book that's supposed to be pretty much entirely orally related from one person to another. It's not an epistolary novel where somebody came upon all of these letters and then was able to put them together into a book and sell it to you. This is all supposed to be Victor telling the story to Walton, and then Walton writing down what he remembers, because he says he doesn't take any notes while he's listening to Victor, and then sending it to his relative back in London. So it's just something to be aware of, and to know that there's discussion about this. It's not really a big deal, and I certainly don't feel that it interrupts the flow or the importance of the story at all. I think, in fact, it gives you the emotional edge that you need to have the story do what it inevitably does to you. And on that note, I'm going to read you a comment that we got from Dawn about Frankenstein. She says, while I've read Frankenstein several times in several contexts, it seems I've not read it since having children. Is it crazy that I just had to stop listening because tears are streaming down my face? My heart is aching, imagining the poor innocent monster opening his eyes for the first time only to see horror and rejection, being left alone and confused, hopefully searching out the only connection he has to this world again, only to have the same thing happen. It hurt. I had to stop. This has never hit me this way before. Uncomfortable to get through? Yes. Cursing out Victor as a freaking weenie? Yep. Sobbing and wanting to hug the monster and wipe his tears and give him cookies and tuck him in? No. Man, she's good. And it's true. I have found that I'm having a much different reaction to the book as well. And the monster waking up scene is particularly upsetting and traumatic. And of course, that will all come into play again very, very soon. And so without pausing any more before we get to the narrative, I am going to fire up Chapter 6 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus.
Little alteration except the growth of our dear children has taken place since you left us. The blue lake and snow-clad mountains, they never change. And I think our placid home and our contented hearts are regulated by the same immutable laws. My trifling occupations take up my time and amuse me, and I am rewarded for any exertions by seeing none but happy, kind faces around me. Since you left us, but one change has taken place in our little household. Do you remember on what occasion Justine Moritz entered our family? Probably you do not. I will relate her history, therefore, in a few words. Madame Moritz, her mother, was a widow with 4 children, of whom Justine was the third. This girl had always been the favorite of her father, but through a strange perversity, her mother could not endure her, and after the death of Monsieur Moritz, treated her very ill. My aunt observed this, and when Justine was 12 years of age, prevailed on her mother to allow her to live at our house. The republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it. Hence, there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders, being neither so poor nor so despised, their manners are more refined and moral. A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France and England. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and a sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. Justine, you may remember, was a great favorite of yours, and I recollect you once remarked that if you were in an ill humor, one glance from Justine could dissipate it, for the same reason that Ariosto gives concerning the beauty of Angelica. She looked so frank-hearted and happy. My aunt conceived a great attachment for her, by which she was induced to give her an education superior to that which she had first intended. This benefit was fully repaid. Justine was the most grateful little creature in the world. I do not mean that she made any professions. I never heard one pass her lips, but you could see by her eyes that she almost adored her protectress. Although her disposition was gay and in many respects inconsiderate, yet she paid the greatest attention to every gesture of my aunt. She thought her the model of all excellence and endeavored to imitate her phraseology and manners, so that even now she often reminds me of her. When my dearest aunt died, everyone was too much occupied in their own grief to notice poor Justine, who had attended her during her illness with the most anxious affection. Poor Justine was very ill, but other trials were reserved for her. One by one her brothers and sister died, and her mother, with the exception of her neglected daughter, was left childless. The conscience of the woman was troubled. She began to think that the deaths of her favorites was a judgment from heaven to chastise her partiality. She was a Roman Catholic, and I believe her confessor confirmed the idea which she had conceived. Accordingly, a few months after your departure for Ingolstadt, Justine was called home by her repentant mother. Poor girl! She wept when she quitted our house. She was much altered since the death of my aunt. Grief had given softness and a winning mildness to her manners, which had before been remarkable for vivacity. Nor was her residence at her mother's house of a nature to restore her gaiety. The poor woman was very vacillating in her repentance. She sometimes begged Justine to forgive her unkindness, but much oftener accused her of having caused the deaths of her brothers and sister. Perpetual fretting at length threw Madame Moritz into a decline, which at first increased her irritability. But she is now at peace forever. She died on the first approach of cold weather at the beginning of this last winter. Justine has just returned to us, and I assure you I love her tenderly. She is very clever and gentle, and extremely pretty. As I mentioned before, her mind and her expression continually remind me of my dear aunt. I must say also a few words to you, my dear cousin, of little darling William. I wish you could see him. He is very tall of his age, with sweet laughing blue eyes, dark eyelashes, and curling hair. When he smiles, 2 little dimples appear on each cheek, which are rosy with health. He has already had 1 or 2 little wives, but Louisa Byron is his favorite, a pretty little girl of 5 years of age. Now, dear Victor, I dare say you wish to be indulged in a little gossip concerning the good people of Geneva. The pretty Miss Mansfield has already received the congratulatory visits on her approaching marriage with a young Englishman, John Melbourne, Esquire. Her ugly sister Manon married Monsieur Duvillard, the rich banker, last autumn. Your favorite schoolfellow, Louis Manoir, has suffered several misfortunes since the departure of Clerval from Geneva. But he has already recovered his spirits and is reported to be on the point of marrying a lively, pretty French woman, Madame Tavernier. She is a widow and much older than Manoir, but she is very much admired and a favorite with everybody. I have written myself into better spirits, dear cousin, but my anxiety returns upon me as I conclude. Write, dearest Victor, 1 line, 1 word will be a blessing to us. 10,000 thanks to Henry for his kindness, his affection, and his many letters. We are sincerely grateful. Adieu, my cousin. Take care of yourself, and I entreat you, write. Elizabeth Lavenza. Geneva, March 18th, 17... Dear, dear Elizabeth, I exclaimed when I had read her letter. I will write instantly and relieve them from the anxiety they must feel. I wrote, and this exertion greatly fatigued me. But my convalescence had commenced and proceeded regularly. In another fortnight I was able to leave my chamber. One of my first duties on my recovery was to introduce Clerval to the several professors of the university. In doing this, I underwent a kind of rough usage, ill-befitting the wounds that my mind had sustained. Ever since the fatal night, the end of my labors and the beginning of my misfortunes, I had conceived a violent antipathy even to the name of natural philosophy. When I was otherwise quite restored to health, the sight of a chemical instrument would renew all the agony of my nervous symptoms. Henry saw this and had removed all my apparatus from my view. He had also changed my apartment, for he perceived that I had acquired a dislike for the room which had previously been my laboratory. But these cares of Clerval were made of no avail when I visited the professors. Monsieur Waldman inflicted torture when he praised, with kindness and warmth, the astonishing progress I had made in the sciences. He soon perceived that I disliked the subject, but not guessing the real cause, he attributed my feelings to modesty and changed the subject from my improvement to the science itself, with a desire, as I evidently saw, of drawing me out. What could I do? He meant to please, and he tormented me. I felt as if he had placed carefully, one by one, in my view, those instruments which were to be afterwards used in putting me to a slow and cruel death. I writhed under his words, yet dared not exhibit the pain I felt. Clerval, whose eyes and feelings were always quick in discerning the sensations of others, declined the subject, alleging in excuse his total ignorance, and the conversation took a more general turn. I thanked my friend from my heart, but I did not speak. I saw plainly that he was surprised, but he never attempted to draw my secret from me. And although I loved him with a mixture of affection and reverence that knew no bounds, yet I could never persuade myself to confide in him that event which was so often present to my recollection, but which I feared the detail to another would only impress more deeply. Monsieur Krempe was not equally docile, and in my condition at that time of almost insupportable sensitiveness, his harsh, blunt encomiums gave me even more pain than the benevolent approbation of Monsieur Waldman. "Damn the fellow!" cried he. "Why, Monsieur Clerval, I assure you he has outstripped us all. Aye, stare if you please, but it is nevertheless true. A youngster who but a few years ago believed in Cornelius Agrippa as firmly as in the Gospel has now set himself at the head of the university. And if he is not soon pulled down, we shall all be out of countenance. Aye, aye," continued he, observing my face expressive of suffering, "Monsieur Frankenstein is modest, an excellent quality in a young man. Young men should be diffident of themselves, you know, Monsieur Clerval. I was myself when young, but that wears out in a very short time." Monsieur Krempe had now commenced a eulogy on himself, which happily turned the conversation from a subject that was so annoying to me. Clerval had never sympathized in my tastes for natural science, and his literary pursuits differed wholly from those which had occupied me. He came to the university with the design of making himself complete master of the Oriental languages, and thus he should open a field for the plan of life he had marked out for himself. Resolved to pursue no inglorious career, he turned his eyes toward the East, as affording scope for his spirit of enterprise. The Persian, Arabic, and Sanskrit languages engaged his attention, and I was easily induced to enter on the same studies. Idleness had ever been irksome to me, and now that I wished to fly from reflection and hated my former studies, I felt great relief in being the fellow pupil with my friend, and found not only instruction, but consolation in the works of the Orientalists. I did not, like him, attempt a critical knowledge of their dialects, for I did not contemplate making any other use of them than temporary amusement. I read merely to understand their meaning, and they well repaid my labors. Their melancholy is soothing, and their joy elevating, to a degree I never experienced in studying the authors of any other country. When you read their writings, life appears to consist in a warm sun and a garden of roses, in the smiles and frowns of a fair enemy, and the fire that consumes your own heart. How different from the manly and heroical poetry of Greece and Rome! Summer passed away in these occupations, and my return to Geneva was fixed for the latter end of autumn. But being delayed by several accidents, winter and snow arrived. The roads were deemed impassable, and my journey was retarded until the ensuing spring. I felt this delay very bitterly, for I longed to see my native town and my beloved friends. My return had only been delayed so long from an unwillingness to leave Clerval in a strange place, before he had become acquainted with any of its inhabitants. The winter, however, was spent cheerfully, and although the spring was uncommonly late, when it came, its beauty compensated for its dilatoriness. The month of May had already commenced, and I expected the letter daily which was to fix the date of my departure, when Henry proposed a pedestrian tour in the environs of Ingolstadt, that I might bid a personal farewell to the country I had so long inhabited. I acceded with pleasure to this proposition. I was fond of exercise, and Clerval had always been my favorite companion in the ramble of this nature that I had taken among the scenes of my native country. We passed a fortnight in these perambulations. My health and spirits had long been restored, and they gained additional strength from the salubrious air I breathed, the natural incidents of our progress, and the conversation of my friend. Study had before secluded me from the intercourse of my fellow creatures and rendered me unsocial, but Clerval called forth the better feelings of my heart. He again taught me to love the aspect of nature and the cheerful faces of children. Excellent friend, how sincerely you did love me and endeavor to elevate my mind until it was on a level with your own. A selfish pursuit had cramped and narrowed me, until your gentleness and affection warmed and opened my senses. I became the same happy creature who, a few years ago, loved and beloved by all, had no sorrow or care. When happy inanimate nature had the power of bestowing on me the most delightful sensations. A serene sky and verdant fields filled me with ecstasy. The present season was indeed divine. The flowers of spring bloomed in the hedges, while those of summer were already in bud. I was undisturbed by thoughts which during the preceding year had pressed upon me, notwithstanding my endeavors to throw them off, with an invincible burden. Henry rejoiced in my gaiety and sincerely sympathized in my feelings. He exerted himself to amuse me while he expressed the sensations that filled his soul. The resources of his mind on this occasion were truly astonishing. His conversation was full of imagination, and very often, in imitation of the Persian and Arabic writers, he invented tales of wonderful fancy and passion. At other times, he repeated my favorite poems or drew me out into arguments, which he supported with great ingenuity. We returned to our college on a Sunday afternoon. The peasants were dancing, and everyone we met appeared gay and happy. My own spirits were high, and I bounded along with feelings of unbridled joy and hilarity. This is the end of Chapter 6.
A very happy pastoral moment in the life of Victor Frankenstein, one that it is about to be shattered. So, somewhere between the creation of the monster and what happens in Chapter 7, 2 years will have passed. It doesn't matter so much that you know that as that you aren't shocked by it when somebody mentions it, because then you're going to be pulled out of the narrative and you're going to say, wait a minute, when did 2 years pass? Chapter 7 is 2 years later. I sat here and tried to figure it out myself, and I'm sure that if I had spent more time on it, I could have, but be that as it may, I'm not going to belabor the fact. I do want to remind you of a couple of logistics. Victor and Clerval's school is in Ingolstadt, and Victor and Clerval's home is in Geneva. This will matter in a moment. You've heard that Victor is having a lovely time tromping about the hillside with Clerval, loving nature, which is, again, a very romantic, capital R, thing to do. That, going back into the nature, that's a joke. When my husband was in Slovakia, the kids would ask him, would you like to go for a walk in the nature? And it just stuck. So the whole idea of going out to nature to renew yourself and rejuvenate yourself and purify yourself and cleanse yourself and get rid of all of the, the science and the urban landscape, such as it was at the time. I know it's still fairly pastoral as far as we're concerned, but an urban landscape for them, they kind of cleansed and purged themselves of all of that. Well, this is also a moment to discuss the word hubris. Hubris is technically excessive pride. It is also contained, I believe, in the statement, pride goeth before a fall. Hubris is what you are exhibiting when you say, oh, but that's okay. I never make mistakes like that. And then you promptly make that mistake. Victor thinks on whatever level, whether it's subconsciously or consciously, that he has beaten his own illness, this overarching need, this passion, this addiction to science that he had? Well, there's hubris, which is Victor's main problem, but then there's hamartia, which is sometimes translated as a tragic flaw. With Oedipus, there's always a Aristotelian tragic figure has a tragic flaw. It is the thing that makes them blow it and become a tragic figure. I've also been reading that hamartia is literally translated as missing the mark, which I thought was interesting because the word sin, as far as I was told, is also a phrase or a word that means missing the mark, as used in archery, that, you were aiming to do it the right way, but you kind of blew it and it didn't work out so well. So hamartia and hubris are two things that we are going to be bringing up from time to time for the rest of this book. You just can't help it. There are a couple other things that I need to warn you about that are going to happen in this chapter. Some of you, I'm sure, were surprised that in the last chapter there was no monster. I mean, we just woke him up, for goodness sake. Where's the monster? You'll get some monster in this. Not a lot, but you'll get some monster. And it's shocking. And you'll wonder what in the world has happened. And you'll find out, just not today. The other thing that I want to bring your attention to is Mary Shelley's use of light as a symbol. And it's light not just in the illumination sense, as it is in a kind of an overlapping series of symbolic motifs. You have Walton traveling to the land of eternal light, which obviously he's going to the North Pole. When it's the summertime, the sun doesn't set up there, or at least not much. So you've got that, but he's also looking for enlightenment. In his own romantic way, not necessarily scientific enlightenment, but a friend, knowledge, adventure, all of these things. Victor talks about out of the darkness, this light emerges, and the light is knowledge. And the light, it lights him on fire with passion. But that fire, when it's no longer a metaphor and is in fact just fire is dangerous. And playing with fire is dangerous. And Victor has been playing with fire. Victor was playing God. And that brings us to Mary Shelley's subtitle to Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. We haven't talked about that a whole lot yet, but I've been writing about Prometheus for one of my day jobs. And there's the whole Prometheus, Epimetheus, forethought and afterthought. Now, I seem to have a vague memory that is in fact not how their names actually translate. And I'm sure someone who's listening knows more about this than I do. I could go back into my Greek and Roman classics class and probably dig up something really amazing. But although I'm interested, and I would love to have someone tell me, it's not the important part here, because Mary Shelley wouldn't have known what it is that we're talking about. Mary Shelley would have known Prometheus and Epimetheus, forethought and afterthought. The modern Prometheus is, to sum up the story of Prometheus, he tried to give fire to the humans. He tried to do it legitimately by going to Zeus and asking Zeus to help him with this project. Zeus denied him because humans are dangerous. And you don't mess with humans, and you certainly don't give them something like fire. Prometheus felt that it was unfair that all the animals had claws or horns or extraordinary speed or extraordinary size, and the poor little humans were just schlubbing along and not doing very well, and felt that because they were such an interesting and unique creation and didn't have fur or claws or extraordinary speed, that they should have something else. So he steals fire and he brings it back to the humans, all the while knowing full well that when he was caught, and he would be caught, he was going to be punished. So even though he knew that his sacrifice was more important to the future of mankind than being tied to a rock and having his liver pecked out every day by an eagle, which is in fact the punishment that he was given. Victor played with fire. Victor decided that he was at least as good as, if not better than, God, because he was human, and yet he could also bestow life. That's the hubris. But that's also the Promethean thing. He thinks that the science he is pursuing, and you've heard him talk about how important it is to pursue science. This pure pursuit of science is something that is, it's better than all the other disciplines because you can always go farther. You can always learn more. You can stand on the shoulders of those who've come before you and keep going. Whereas, if you're going to study Latin, you pretty much study the same Latin that everybody else has studied, and who cares about that? He is trying to bestow a gift on humanity that he thinks will be as important as, say, fire. Of course, he's blinded by the fact that he's lost his mother, and somewhere, he's thinking, if I could just figure out how this life thing works, I could bring her back. And it doesn't take a genius to go, wow, that's really creepy and wrong. That's a really bad zombie movie. Don't do it. Don't do it. Get out. It's that kind of thing. Victor, however, because this is a tragedy, will not listen to reason and just gets more and more obsessed and passionate about this dirty little secret of what he's creating. Much as Prometheus probably got, distracted by and obsessed by getting fire to the humans because he thought it was the right thing to do. So if this is the parallel Shelley is drawing, then you know very clearly what's going to happen to Victor. I'm not going to say anything else because it's going to take us chapters and chapters to get there. But it's something that you should be thinking about as we approach the middle and then eventually the end of the book, that Victor's going to get it. Somehow, some way, someone's going to get to Victor, because you cannot perpetrate an act of hubris as huge as this man did and not pay for it eventually. I think that's all. I've given you way, 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 way too much information. I hope if that was overwhelming that you go back and listen to it, because there were a bunch of really important things in there. But enough. It is time for Chapter 7, our last chapter for today, of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley.
On my return, I found the following letter from my father. My dear Victor, you have probably waited impatiently for a letter to fix the date of your return to us, and I was at first tempted to write only a few lines, merely mentioning the day on which I should expect you. But that would be a cruel kindness, and I dare not do it. What would be your surprise, my son, when you expected a happy and glad welcome, to behold on the contrary tears and wretchedness? And how, Victor, can I relate our misfortune? Absence cannot have rendered you callous to our joys and griefs. How shall I inflict pain on my long-absent son? I wish to prepare you for the woeful news, but I know it is impossible. Even now your eye skims over the page to seek the words which are to convey to you the horrible tidings. William is dead. That sweet child whose smiles delighted and warmed my heart, who was so gentle yet so gay. Victor, he is murdered. I will not attempt to console you, but will simply relate the circumstances of the transaction. Last Thursday, May the 7th, I, my niece, and your two brothers went to walk in Plein Palais. The evening was warm and serene, and we prolonged our walk farther than usual. It was already dusk before we thought of returning, and then we discovered that William and Ernest, who had gone on before, were not to be found. We accordingly rested on a seat until they should return. Presently Ernest came, and inquired if we had seen his brother. He said that he had been playing with him, that William had run away to hide himself, and that he vainly sought for him, and afterwards he waited a long time, but that he did not return. This account rather alarmed us, and we continued to search for him until night fell, when Elizabeth conjectured that he might have returned to the house. He was not there. We returned again with torches, for I could not rest when I thought that my sweet boy had lost himself, and was exposed to all the damps and dews of night. Elizabeth also suffered extreme anguish. About 5 in the morning, I discovered my lovely boy, whom the night before I had seen blooming and active in health, stretched on the grass, livid and motionless. The print of the murderer's finger was on his neck. He was conveyed home, and the anguish that was visible in my countenance betrayed the secret to Elizabeth. She was very earnest to see the corpse. At first, I attempted to prevent her, but she persisted, and entering the room where it lay, hastily examined the neck of the victim, and clasping her hands exclaimed, "Oh God, I have murdered my darling child." She fainted and was restored with extreme difficulty. When she again lived, it was only to weep and sigh. She told me that same evening William had teased her to let him wear a very valuable miniature which he possessed of your mother. This picture is gone, and was doubtless the temptation which urged the murderer to the deed. We have no trace of him at present, although our exertions to discover him are unremitted, but they will not restore my beloved William. Come, dearest Victor, you alone can console Elizabeth. She weeps continually and accuses herself unjustly as the cause of his death. Her words pierce my heart. We are all unhappy, but will not that be an additional motive for you, my son, to return and be our comforter? Your dear mother. Alas, Victor, I now say, thank God she did not live to witness the cruel, miserable death of her youngest darling. Come, Victor, not brooding thoughts of vengeance against the assassin, but with feelings of peace and gentleness that will heal, instead of festering the wounds of our minds. Enter the house of mourning, my friend, but with kindness and affection for those who love you, and not with hatred for your enemies. Your affectionate and afflicted father, Alphonse Frankenstein. Geneva, May 12th, 17 blank blank. Clerval, who had watched my countenance as I read this letter, was surprised to observe the despair that succeeded the joy I at first expressed on receiving news from my friends. I threw the letter on the table and covered my face with my hands. "My dear Frankenstein," exclaimed Henry when he perceived me weep with bitterness, "are you always to be unhappy? My dear friend, what has happened?" I motioned him to take up the letter while I walked up and down the room in the extremest agitation. Tears also gushed from the eyes of Clerval as he read the account of my misfortune. "I can offer you no consolation, my friend," said he. "Your disaster is irreparable. What do you intend to do?" "To go instantly to Geneva. Come with me, Henry, to order the horses." During our walk, Clerval endeavoured to say a few words of consolation. He could only express his heartfelt sympathy. "Poor William," said he, "dear, lovely child, he now sleeps with his angel mother. Who that had seen him bright and joyous in his young beauty, but must weep over his untimely loss? To die so miserably, to feel the murderer's grasp, how much more a murdered that could destroy radiant innocence? Poor little fellow, one only consolation have we. His friends mourn and weep, but he is at rest. The pang is over, his sufferings are at an end forever. A sod covers his gentle form, and he knows no pain. He can no longer be a subject for pity. We must reserve that for his miserable survivors." Clerval spoke thus as we hurried through the streets. The words impressed themselves on my mind, and I remembered them afterwards in solitude. But now, as soon as the horses arrived, I hurried into a cabriolet and bade farewell to my friend. My journey was very melancholy. At first I wished to hurry on, for I longed to console and sympathize with my loved and sorrowing friends. But when I drew near my native town, I slackened my progress. I could hardly sustain the multitude of feelings that crowded into my mind. I passed through scenes familiar to my youth, but which I had not seen for nearly 6 years. How altered everything might be during that time! One sudden and desolating change had taken place, but 1,000 little circumstances might have done by degrees worked other alterations, which, although they were done more tranquilly, might not be the less decisive. Fear overcame me. I dared no advance, dreading 1,000 nameless evils that made me tremble, although I was unable to define them. I remained 2 days at Lausanne, in this painful state of mind. I contemplated the lake. The waters were placid, all around was calm, and the snowy mountains, the palaces of nature, were not changed. By degrees the calm and heavenly scene restored me, and I continued my journey towards Geneva. The road ran by the side of the lake, which became narrower as I approached my native town. I discovered more distinctly the black sides of Jura and the bright summit of Mont Blanc. I wept like a child. "Dear mountains, my own beautiful lake, how do you welcome your wanderer? Your summits are clear, the sky and lake are blue and placid. Is this to prognosticate peace, or to mock at my unhappiness? I fear, my friend, that I shall render myself tedious by dwelling on these preliminary circumstances, but they were days of comparative happiness, and I think of them with pleasure. My country, my beloved country, who but a native can tell the delight I took in again beholding thy streams, thy mountains, and more than all, thy lovely lake? Yet, as I drew nearer home, grief and fear again overcame me. Night also closed around, and when I could hardly see the dark mountains, I felt still more gloomily. The picture appeared a vast and dim scene of evil, and I foresaw obscurely that I was destined to become the most wretched of human beings. Alas, I prophesied truly, and failed only in one single circumstance, that in all the misery I imagined and dreaded, I did not conceive the 100th part of the anguish I was destined to endure. It was completely dark when I arrived in the environs of Geneva. The gates of the town were already shut, and I was obliged to pass the night at Secheron, a village at the distance of half a league from the city. The sky was serene, and, as I was unable to rest, I resolved to visit the spot where my poor William had been murdered. As I could not pass through the town, I was obliged to cross the lake in a boat to arrive at Plainpalais. During this short voyage, I saw the lightning playing on the summit of Mont Blanc in the most beautiful figures. The storm appeared to approach rapidly, and on landing, I ascended a low hill that I might observe its progress. It advanced, the heavens were clouded, and I soon felt the rain coming slowly in large drops, but its violence quickly increased. I quitted my seat and walked on, although the darkness and storm increased every minute and the thunder burst with a terrific crash over my head. It was echoed from Salève, the Juras, and the Alps of Savoy. Vivid flashes of lightning dazzled my eyes, illuminating the lake, making it appear like a vast sheet of fire. Then, for an instant, everything seemed of a pitchy darkness, until the eye recovered itself from the preceding flash. The storm, as is often the case in Switzerland, appeared at once in various parts of the heavens. The most violent storm hung exactly north of the town, over the part of the lake which lies between the promontory of Bellerive and the village of Coppet. Another storm enlightened Jura with faint flashes, and another darkened and sometimes disclosed the Mole, a peaked mountain to the east of the lake. While I watched the tempest, so beautiful yet terrific, I wandered on with a hasty step. This noble war in the sky elevated my spirits. I clasped my hands and exclaimed aloud, "William, dear angel, this is thy funeral, this is thy dirge." As I said these words, I perceived in the gloom a figure which stole from behind a clump of trees near me. I stood fixed, gazing intently. It could not be mistaken. A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me. Its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch, the filthy demon to whom I had given life. What did he there? Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. The figure passed me quickly, and I lost it in the gloom. Nothing in human shape could have destroyed the fair child. He was the murderer, I could not doubt it. The mere presence of the idea was an irresistible proof of the fact. I thought of pursuing the devil, but it would have been in vain, for another flash discovered him to me, hanging among the rocks of the nearly perpendicular ascent of Mount Salève, a hill that bounds Plainpalais on the south. He soon reached the summit and disappeared. I remained motionless. The thunder ceased, but the rain still continued, and the scene was enveloped in an impenetrable darkness. I revolved in my mind the events which I had until now sought to forget, the whole train of my progress towards the creation, the appearance of the works of my own hands at my bedside, its departure. 2 years had now nearly elapsed since the night on which he first received life. And was this his first crime? Alas, I had turned loose into the world a depraved wretch, whose delight was in carnage and misery. Had he not murdered my brother? No one can conceive the anguish I suffered during the remainder of the night, which I spent, cold and wet, in the open air. But I did not feel the inconvenience of the weather. My imagination was busy in scenes of evil and despair. I considered the being whom I had cast among mankind and endowed with the will and power to effect purposes of horror, such as the deed which he had now done, nearly in the light of my own vampire, my own spirit let loose from the grave and forced to destroy all that was dear to me. Day dawned, and I directed my steps towards the town. The gates were open, and I hastened to my father's house. My first thought was to discover what I knew of the murderer and cause instant pursuit to be made. But I paused when I reflected on the story that I had to tell. A being whom I myself had formed and endued with life had met me at midnight among the precipices of an inaccessible mountain. I remembered also the nervous fever with which I had been seized just at that time that I dated my creation, and which would give an air of delirium to a tale otherwise so utterly improbable. I well knew that if any other had communicated such a revelation to me, I would have looked upon it as the ravings of an insanity. Besides, the strange nature of the animal would elude all pursuit, even if I were so far credited as to persuade my relatives to commence it. And then, of what use would be pursuit? Who could arrest a creature capable of scaling the overhanging sides of Mont Salève? These reflections determined me, and I resolved to remain silent. It was about 5 in the morning when I entered my father's house. I told the servants not to disturb the family, but went into the library to attend their usual hour of rising. 6 years had elapsed, passed in a dream but for one indelible trace, and I stood in the same place where I had last embraced my father before my departure for Ingolstadt. Beloved and venerable parent, he still remained to me. I gazed on the picture of my mother, which stood over the mantelpiece. It was an historical subject, painted at my father's desire, and represented Caroline Beaufort in an agony of despair, kneeling by the coffin of her dead father. Her garb was rustic, and her cheek pale, but there was an air of dignity and beauty that hardly permitted the sentiment of pity. Below this picture was a miniature of William, and my tears flowed when I looked upon it. While I was thus engaged, Ernest entered. He had heard me arrive, and hastened to welcome me. "Welcome, my dearest Victor," said he. "Ah, I wish you had come 3 months ago, and then you would have found us all joyous and delighted. Come to us now to share a misery which nothing can alleviate. Yet your presence will, I hope, revive our father, who seems sinking under his misfortune. And your persuasions will induce poor Elizabeth to cease her vain and tormenting self-accusations. Poor William, he was our darling and our pride." Tears, unrestrained, fell from my brother's eyes. A sense of mortal agony crept over my frame. Before, I had only imagined the wretchedness of my desolated home. The reality came on me as a new and a not less terrible disaster. I tried to calm Ernest. I inquired more minutely concerning my father. Her I named my cousin. "She, most of all," said Ernest, "requires consolation. She accused herself of having caused the death of my brother, and that made her very wretched. But since the murderer has been discovered—" "The murderer discovered? Good God, how can that be? Who could attempt to pursue him? It is impossible. One might as well try to overtake the winds, or confine a mountain stream with a straw. I saw him too. He was free last night." "I do not know what you mean," replied my brother, in accents of wonder. "But to us the discovery we have made completes our mystery. No one would believe it at first, and even now Elizabeth will not be convinced, notwithstanding all the evidence. Indeed, who would credit that Justine Moritz, who was so amiable and fond of all the family, could suddenly become so capable of so frightful, so appalling a crime?" "Justine Moritz? Poor girl, is she the accused? But it is wrongfully. Everyone knows that. No one believes it, surely, Ernest?" "No one did at first, but several circumstances came out that have almost forced conviction upon us, and her own behaviour has been so confused as to add to the evidence of facts a weight that, I fear, leaves no hope for doubt. But she will be tried today, and you will then hear all." He then related that, the morning on which the murder of poor William had been discovered, Justine had been taken ill and confined to her bed for several days. During this interval, one of the servants, happening to examine the apparel she had worn on the night of the murder, had discovered in her pocket the picture of my mother, which had been judged to be the temptation of the murderer. The servant instantly showed it to one of the others, who, without saying a word to any of the family, went to a magistrate, and, upon their deposition, Justine was apprehended. On being charged with the fact, the poor girl confirmed the suspicion, in a great measure, by her extreme confusion of manner. This was a strange tale, but it did not shake my faith, and I replied earnestly, "You are all mistaken. I know the murderer. Justine, poor good Justine, is innocent." At that instant my father entered. I saw unhappiness deeply impressed on his countenance, but he endeavoured to welcome me cheerfully, and, after we had exchanged our mournful greeting, would have introduced some other topic than that of our disaster, had not Ernest exclaimed, "Good God, Papa! Victor says that he knows who was the murderer of our poor William." "We do also, unfortunately," replied my father, "for indeed I had rather have been forever ignorant than have discovered so much depravity and ungratitude in one I valued so highly. My dear father, you are mistaken. Justine is innocent. If she is, God forbid that she should suffer as guilty. She is to be tried today, and I sincerely hope, that she will be acquitted." This speech calmed me. I was firmly convinced in my own mind that Justine, and indeed every human being, was guiltless of this murder. I had no fear, therefore, that any circumstantial evidence could be brought forward strong enough to convict her. My tale was not one to announce publicly. Its astounding horror would be looked upon as madness by the vulgar. Did anyone indeed exist, except I, the Creator, who would believe, unless his senses convinced him, in the existence of the living monument of presumption and rash ignorance which I had let loose upon the world? We were soon joined by Elizabeth. Time had altered her since I last beheld her. It had endowed her with loveliness surpassing the beauty of her childish years. There was the same candour, the same vivacity, but it was allied to an expression more full of sensibility and intellect. She welcomed me with the greatest affection. "Your arrival, my dear cousin," said she, "fills me with hope. You perhaps will find some means to justify my poor guiltless Justine. Alas, who is safe if she can be convicted of crime? I rely on her innocence as certainly as I do upon my own. Our misfortune is doubly hard to us. We have not only lost that lovely darling boy, but this poor girl, whom I sincerely love, is to be torn away by even a worse fate. If she is condemned, I never shall know joy more. But she will not, I am sure she will not, and then I shall be happy again, even after the sad death of my little William." "She is innocent, my Elizabeth," said I, "and that shall be proved. Fear nothing, but let your spirits be cheered by the assurance of her acquittal." "How kind and generous you are! Everyone else believes in her guilt, and that made me wretched, for I knew it was impossible, and to see everyone else prejudiced in so deadly a manner rendered me hopeless and despairing." She wept. "Dearest niece," said my father, "dry your tears. If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our laws and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." End of Chapter 7.
You can find show notes for this episode and links to other episodes at craftlit.com. CraftLit also appears anywhere you can get a podcast: iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and on, including its own dedicated app. There are lots of ways to support CraftLit, from patreon.com/craftlit to craftlit.com memberships and channel memberships on YouTube. You can find out more details at craftlit.com/premium. And as always, thank you for your support. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.